We spent the week out of town visiting family, so in lieu of our usual video about getting ready to live off the land, which we're going to start doing very, very soon, we decided to share one of the videos from our online foraging course, The Beginner's Guide to Foraging Your Own Food. This is one of over 40 modules where we show you how to identify, harvest, process, and cook with wild food. So if you find this video useful, check below for the link in the description, and you can use the code HICKORY for 10% off the entire course. The course platform also has a chat function where you can send Jordan and me all of your foraging related questions, and we will answer them as soon as possible to the best of our knowledge. All right, so without further ado, here's how we forage hickories, one of our favorite wild foods.
There's really nothing in the world of foraging that I find quite as satisfying as having a giant pile of hickory nuts. To me, having a few bushels of hickory nuts in the basement is equivalent to Scrooge McDuck's pool of gold so deep that he could swim in it, though we've never actually filled our basement with hickory nuts. One day. Hickory nuts are full of fat, protein, and densely packed calories, so they really keep you fed in the winter months. They have a buttery, slightly astringent flavor that you're familiar with if you've ever eaten a pecan, which is actually a species of hickory. Pecans are native to the southeastern portion of the US, but other species like shagbark and pignut grow as far north as Maine and Ontario. Compared to black walnuts, hickory nuts are easy to open and remove from the shell, but if you're used to store-bought cultivated nuts, you might be surprised how hard they are to open. We use a heavy-duty nutcracker specifically designed for hard-shelled wild nuts like black walnuts and hickories to open ours, and with a tool like that you can easily remove the nut meat from the shell. Hickory nuts are great as a raw snack, toasted with salt, or pressed for hickory nut oil. They can also be made into an excellent nut milk drink by boiling the pulverized nuts in water and straining out the shells and nut meal. This technique was developed by the Cherokee people of the southeast, where it's called knutschi. Traditionally, knutschi is either sweetened and drank like a nut milk, or used savory in soups with rice or hominy. There are many different species of hickory nuts in North America, and some of them taste better than others, but these defining characteristics will help you identify hickories in general, and then you can decide which you like best for yourself. Hickory trees have gray bark, and some, like shagbark hickory, have a very distinctive shaggy scaled bark. Others, like pignut, also known as oil nut hickories, have a tighter bark pattern more similar to red oak trees. The mature trees are very large and form a big proportion of the forest canopy in the deciduous forests of eastern North America. Hickory leaves are compound and alternately arranged on the branches. Hickory fruit all begin as small green round balls, most often with 4 segments protecting the tan nut inside. As they ripen, the segments that form the hull will typically release the nut and fall free. This is especially true in species like shagbark and pecans. For those species, if you find a nut with a strongly adhering hull, those are most often underdeveloped and not worth harvesting. Pignut hickories have a thinner, more flexible hull that often stays attached after the nut is mature, but it can easily be peeled away. Hickory nuts themselves are oval, light brown, and usually have one pointed end and one rounded end. Hickory trees are very common across all of eastern North America, from Texas up to Ontario and Maine. In fact, most of the deciduous forests in the eastern US are referred to as oak hickory forests because they're the 2 primary trees in the forest canopy. The numerous hickory species native to eastern North America have a lot of overlapping ranges, so if you're lucky enough to live in one of those places that has multiple different species of hickory, you can collect a pile of shagbark, pecan, and pignut hickories all in the same patch of woods. We find that the best places to collect hickory nuts are often in areas where they're growing out in the open, whether that be a park, a field, a parking lot, or the edge of the forest. This is partly because there's less competition for sunlight and resources from other trees, but it's also because nut-eating mammals like squirrels and chipmunks feel less secure out in the open, where they can easily get picked off by predators, so they're more likely to leave those nuts for a little while and maybe come out and try to grab them at night. Deep in the forest, where they have plenty of cover, I often feel like the hickory nuts get snatched up by a squirrel or chipmunk the second they hit the ground. Hickory trees will typically start to ripen and drop the nuts a few weeks before your average first frost. I don't think this actually has anything to do with the frost coming, but it is a helpful time marker for when you should start looking for the nuts. Often hickory trees will drop their undeveloped or hollow nuts first, so if you see a bunch of hickory nuts coming down early, chances are they're probably empty, but it doesn't hurt to crack a few open and see if maybe they're just fruiting early one year. Similar to oak trees, hickories use a technique called masting to overwhelm the nut-eating critters that would gobble up every nut if they had the chance. Masting is the process of nut-producing trees producing little to no crop for a couple years in a row, saving up their energy, and then dumping a ton of nuts all at the same time in a given year. This way it overwhelms the predators and there's no way they can eat all the nuts, which means some of them inevitably get planted and grow into new trees. A determined forager could fill a swimming pool with hickory nuts in a good masting year, and while that would be an impressive feat, I would encourage that person to remember to plant a good number of them in a suitable environment so that they don't restrict the future hickory trees from producing. Non-swimming pool foragers should probably do this as well, just as a thank you to the tree for the food that it provided you for the winter. Hickory trees are some of the most important sources of winter calories in the eastern forests. Aside from the obvious nut-eating critters like squirrels and chipmunks, bears, turkeys, deer, raccoons, and even foxes feast on hickory nuts in good years. Their leaves provide food for the aptly named hickory horndevil caterpillars, which turn into beautiful regal moths, and the craggy bark of species like shagbark hickory provide roosting sites for bats.
Hickory nuts usually fall from the tree with at least some of their green hull still attached. If the hull feels fused to the nut and is really hard to get off, then likely the nut didn't fully develop before it fell from the tree and it will never mature and can just be discarded. With fully ripened hickory nuts, the hull should come off with just a little pressure. The easiest way to dehull a lot of them at once is to gather a bunch and just leave them in a warm, dry place. As the hulls and the nuts dry down, they will simply separate from each other naturally. Just be sure that wherever you are storing your hickory nuts as you wait for the hulls to dry down is protected from squirrels or chipmunks, because they will absolutely take advantage of seeing any hickory nuts out in the open and quickly steal the whole lot. We've had this happen before. We found that the float sink test is not as reliable for hickories as it is for black walnuts, especially if you do it after they've had time to sit and dry out a little bit. A lot of the good ones also float in addition to the bad ones. So we like to go through and just discard bad ones as we're cracking them open. We do look at the outside of the nut and discard any that have obvious visible holes in them, which was likely an insect that got in there and ate the nut and then tunneled its way out. Like black walnuts, you can use a hammer or rock to break open hickories, and they are a bit easier than black walnuts. Nevertheless, if you're planning on processing a large quantity, we would still recommend investing in a heavy-duty nutcracker to make the process a breeze.
By far the most common way that we eat hickory nuts is just to crack them open and eat them raw as a snack in the winter, but that's not really a recipe. So what we're going to show you how to make today is a traditional Cherokee nut milk called knutschi. This drink is popular among the Cherokee people of the Southeast as well as other eastern woodland tribes. The beauty of knutschi is that you don't really need to shell the nuts, you just kind of pulverize them, shell and all, into a meal and then boil that, and then you scoop off the oily nut milk. But one issue with that method is that if you get a bad nut in the mix, it can just get kind of mixed in with everything and be difficult to separate. So what we like to do is go through and just crack them open in half just to make sure that it's a good nut before we add it to the pile to pulverize. Alright, so now we've got a full bowl of crushed up hickory nuts. There's some shell in there, which is totally fine, as I mentioned. And what we could do now is use this to pulverize it, which is the traditional way. I think traditionally they would use a big hollowed out log and a hickory stump to smash it into a pulverized meal. But with our molcajete, it has these little holes in here and a lot of the nut meal will get smushed into them. And just to avoid losing any of that, we're going to use a high-powered blender, and the shells from hickory are actually soft enough to get ground up by that blender. Once the knutschi has simmered for a while, all of the heavy shell pieces will sink down to the bottom, and then the best way to get the cream is just to scoop it off the top. Sweetened knutschi is also traditional. I think typically they'll use maple syrup to sweeten it or maple sugar, but because most of our sugar comes from honey, we're going to use about a tablespoon of honey in each glass. So there you have it, that's Cherokee knutschi. And we want to give a shout out to Sammy Stills, who's a Cherokee culture keeper that we learned this recipe from. He has some videos up on YouTube if you want to check out and learn more information about how this is traditionally made. Sylvan, would you like a glass of delicious kanachi?
Don't mind if I do. Cheers. Oh my God. It's truly one of the best things.
I don't know if you're on camera.
No. It's one of the best things.
Yeah. It's like if oatmeal and almond milk sweetened with honey had a baby.
It's so nutty and sweet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this is like...
And easy.
This will fill your belly. This will put some meat on your bones in the winter. Yum.
Thanks for making this.
You're welcome.